Okay. So we are starting the book of Judges. We just did Joshua. Um, One thing I'll say about the books of history, they're roughly in chronological order for the the early days of the Hebrews in Promised Land. But that doesn't mean that they're the same kinds of books. Different writers, different sort of directions. A lot of Joshua had to do with the as you remember, the literal establishment, like when they entered and what they did and who got what land. And as Judy and I met one week, we read through all the cities that were in all the different things, and there were some battles to fight back the people that were already occupying the land and stuff. Judges is a different. Yeah.
Your pastor pronounced every one of them.
I tried my best.
You did good.
we did some skipping too, but I pronounced a lot of them. Yeah. So the book of Judges has more sort of stories in it, and has some really interesting stories. Basically the history section is Joshua through 2 Kings, and it does follow Deuteronomy when Moses was at the edge, about to enter the Promised Land. There's only one other book of the whole Bible that's considered historical, and it's Acts. So we get the history of the people, but we get it not in terms of like a narrative story like we did in Joshua and all the rest of this. Once we get to the 2 Kings, then we hear the history, but we hear it sort of through the prophets or through other things. We don't really get the narrative story as much. Judges was probably somewhere between 1200 and 1000 BC. So we're talking pretty long ago. Joshua was just before that. I think we said somewhere around 1200 to 1400. I could double check. So very early history, right? What did Joshua say? I want to say that's about right. It's hard to tell exactly, but around then somewhere. Well, anyway, and the judges are, in some places, judges are thought of as being sort of like the leaders of the people. In some of the stories, they are. There are people that are literally listed as judges, but it's sort of an interesting role. They could be considered prophets. They could be considered like leaders of the people. They're sort of a little bit of both. So it's what would eventually become kind of the leaders of the temple. And there are a variety of judges that are mentioned. Sometimes they're good, and sometimes they're not as good. So really has some interesting story. We're going to hear about Samson in Judges, and there's a couple other stories. That one of the things about the history books in general is there's stories in the history books that we don't hear as much in the common lectionary in church, that we talk about in Sunday school, but we don't, or that we know from being kids, but we don't really hear in church much, if at all. So I think it's fun to read them for some, like the story I mentioned, Samson. The two stories of Samson don't come up in the lectionary at all. So we never hear about Samson in church, but yet we all know the story of Samson. The two particular parts are the cutting of his hair, which is an interesting story. It's not just cutting his hair, but there's more to it than that. And then him pulling down the building with his strength, pulling down the pillars, holding up the building. So it's interesting that we know the story, but we don't hear it in church, right? And there's other stories in here that we know the stories, but we don't hear them in church. So it's a good book. then we divert, not that you need to know this, but we divert a little bit when we hear Ruth, because Ruth, even though it's the next book, Joshua Judges, Ruth is kind of like a side story. Like it's a side, it's not that it's not part of that history and around that time period, but it sort of steps away from talking about all of the people and then just talking about this one family, right? And then it goes back with Samuel and with Kings to go talking mostly about all of the people. But they, at least these books, Joshua through Kings, are roughly chronological for the people. So you get a little idea, especially if you're understanding that if we didn't read Deuteronomy, if we just read Deuteronomy before we read Joshua, the end of Deuteronomy is the people literally looking out at the promised land. They're at the edge of the border of the promised land. They're about to enter. Moses dies and they enter the promised land. That's the end of the story, right? Then Joshua is they enter the promised land and they're figuring out how to occupy this place. They're fighting people and they're taking over and they're dividing up the land among themselves. That's the bulk of Joshua. And then in Judges, we're hearing a little bit more about the establishment of society and how they're going to rule themselves and organize themselves and stuff. So that's where the Judges take place. So, okay. And there is this first chapter has got some big words, some words in it. Judy.
Yeah, I'm waiting.
Here we go. I'll get
Okay.
limber up my tongue. Okay. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? The Lord said, Judah shall go up. I hereby give the land into his hand. Judah said to his brother Simeon, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. Then I too will go with you into the territory allotted to you. I want to highlight one other thing, which I think is funny. At the end of Joshua, so 2/3 of the way through Joshua, it said the land was divided, but some of the tribes still fought against the Canaanites here and there, or other people that were in the land. And then at the end of Joshua, it says something to the effect of, and then the land was theirs, and they had nobody to fight against, and everybody lived in peace for a generation. Joshua's just barely dead, and it says, and now we have to go fight the Canaanites. So somebody's lying. Because they said, first they said they're fighting against them, then they said, oh, they're not fighting against them. For a generation, they're going to have peace. But then it's not a generation past. Joshua's just died, and they're, oh, we have to go fight against Canaanites. So clearly, that phrase about, I laughed about it last week. I said, wait a second. It says suddenly they're going to be at peace for a generation. That's just not true, right? But somebody stuck that in there to say, now we're all settled and we're all happy, right?
It sure would have been nice, though.
It would have been nice, but here two different places says that's not the case.
Yeah.
So then Judah went up, verse 4. Then Judah went up, and the Lord and gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They came upon Adoni-Bezek at Bezek and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes.
Awful.
Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table, as I have done, so God has paid me back. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. But I understand cutting off thumbs and big toes, but anyway. Then the people of Judah,
I was going to say, obviously, he had cut off a lot of other people's thumbs and big toes, too.
yeah, that's what he said, yeah. It doesn't really say here if there's something specific reference to that. Anyway, Adonai, by the way, we use the word Adonai means Lord. So in Hebrew, a lot of places in the Bible where it says Lord, it's for God, it's Adonai. And Bezek is the people of Bezek. So it's the Lord of Bezek, whatever. That's not a name, that's a title, right? Then the people of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it. they put it to the sword and set the city on fire. Afterwards, the people of Judah went down to fight against Canaanites who lived in the hill country in the Negeb and in the lowland. Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. The name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba, and they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. From there, they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of the Debir was formerly Kiriath Sefer. Then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kiriath Sefer and takes it, I will give him my daughter Akshah as wife. And Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave him his daughter Akshah as wife. So Othniel was the nephew of Caleb, and he took the wife, so his first cousin. Yeah, it's his daughter, right? So his cousin was his wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. As she dismounted from her donkey, Caleb said to her, what do you wish? She said to him, give me a present, since you have set me in the land of the Negeb. Give me also Golath Mayim. So Caleb gave her Upper Golath and Lower Golath. The descendants of Hobab the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negeb near Arad. Then they went and settled with the Amalekites. Judah went with his brother Simeon, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath and devoted to destruction. So the city was called Hormah. So we have Canaanites that they're fighting against all over. Many places. Anyway. Judah took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. The Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the 3 sons of Anak. But the Benjaminites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem among the Benjaminites to this day. So Jerusalem was not established by the Hebrews. We learned that in Joshua, but it's still sort of filled with a variety of different cultures. And they tried to get rid of some of them, and they couldn't. So I love how it says to this day. You know, it's interesting. Jerusalem has been a multicultural city is everywhere in the Bible. You know, and I said that in a previous Bible study that we think of the time at the time of Jesus. We read the Bible as if Jerusalem and Israel are a monoculture, right? But they're not. And there's lots of cultures and lots of languages floating around. We just don't hear about them. Here is sort of confirmation of this to a certain degree, that even from the very beginning, there were multiple cultures in the Holy Land, and they never totally go away. So you have multiple religions, multiple languages, multiple backgrounds, right, in that area. At the time of Jesus, especially, not so much now, but in Judges. But at the time of Jesus, Jerusalem is one of the biggest crossroads of the world in terms of commerce. Everything goes to Jerusalem. So the fact that you could say that it would be a monoculture is kind of, we have to think in terms of, okay, what does it mean if there are all these different cultures and religions and languages being spoken there? That helps us understand the scripture, I think, right? But that's being set up here to a certain degree because the cultures that are already there are there. And now we have the Hebrew culture, and we have other cultures coming through, and Jerusalem is never a monoculture, and then really the whole land is never a monoculture. It isn't today with the fighting between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The house of Joseph also went. This is verse 22. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph sent out spies to Bethel. The name of the city was formerly Luz. When the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, show us a way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you. So he showed them the way into the city, and they put the city to the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. So the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz, and that is its name to this day. So he was in the city that was formerly called Luz, and when he was allowed to go, he built another city and called it Luz. We just moved the city. many of the tribes are being mentioned here and what they did in terms of fighting against the people that were the original inhabitants. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblaim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. But the Canaanites grew to live in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but that did not, in fact, drive them out. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, but the Canaanites lived among them in Gezer. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants, so it's listing all of them. Did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol, but the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alab, or of Akzib, or of Helbah, or of Aphik, or of Rehob, but the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and of Beth Anath became subject to forced labor for them. The Amorites pressed the Danites back into the hill country. They did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites continued to live in Har-Heres and Ahilan and in Shalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rests heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim from Selah and upward. Oh, I got all those names. I find it interesting. Let's rewind for a second. All the inhabitants of the land are put to forced labor. Now, the Hebrews originally came from this land, so it's a circle, right? But when they left this land and ended up in Egypt after Joseph had them in Egypt, they were eventually subjected to forced labor.
Mhm.
And then we have the Exodus, so they weren't be slaves anymore. And they wander in the desert 40 years, and when they get in the land, then they subject all the people in the land to forced labor.
Yeah.
Well, that's just sort of how it worked back then. You know,
Yeah.
you were in charge, you were in charge.
We had a discussion yesterday at St. Peter about how the reason the Hebrew people were put to as were made slaves in Israel in Egypt was I don't know, logical. I mean, logical is a whole other discussion, but remember that we talked about the famine, right? And essentially they kept coming for bread, for grain, until the point they couldn't afford to buy it anymore. And the exchange was they would get grain, but they would be servants of Egypt and slaves. So it was the famine that we hear about with the story of Joseph that led to them being enslaved in Egypt. I think this first chapter is sort of the title. Well, the title of the section, I don't know if it's in your Bible, says Israel's failure to complete the conquest of Canaan.
Mhm.
You know, again, goes against that one statement that at the end of Joshua about, and they lived in peace and prosperity and didn't fight anybody for. I guess it depends on conquest, right? What you mean by conquest. They were in the land and they were living in the land and ruling it, but they couldn't rout out all the former inhabitants. This is like almost every one of those things that they did not drive them out, or they are still there to this day.
Yeah, they didn't assimilate.
Right. There was no assimilation. There was just
No.
either we're going to kill you or but we're not going to have the same culture. But that makes sense if you think about it, because in the previous books, even in Joshua, but certainly in the other books in the Torah, there's so much talk about don't adopt other gods or other languages, or don't intermarry.
Yeah, yeah. Don't assimilate, in other words.
Right. So for them, and then we know that's part of the fall of the tribes of Israel, which happens later on, is you can say some of it's by war, but a lot of it's just because the culture got muddied to the point that it wasn't really part of part of the people of Israel anymore, right? At the time of Jesus, I said this before. At the time of Jesus, there's only really 2 tribes left out of 12.
Yeah.
Part of that's war, but part of it is the same thing. It's intermarrying, and the culture changes, the religion changes enough that it's just not the same anymore. And then we are in chapter 2. Not nearly as many hard words to read in chapter 2. There's a couple, but not too many. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land to tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. So it's sort of saying you're going to be punished for not driving out the people and tearing down their altars.
Mm-hmm. In my book, a footnote says Bochim, the definition of that is weepers.
Wept, yeah, they wept.
People who weep.
Yeah, weepers are those who weep. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, they were supposed to tear down all the altars and they didn't. So didn't drive them out and tear down their altars. It's even geographically, even if I think if we understand the geography of the area, it helps us beyond the socio-political thing to along the south and going east is pretty fertile land, but in the middle there it's just desert, right? So if you're coming from Asia, you're not walking through the desert, you're walking along the southern coast of Asia, which puts you right into that area between Israel and Egypt. So you're the natural trade routes from Asia are going right into Jerusalem. That same desert to the east means that anything from the north gets sort of funneled through along the Mediterranean coast through Israel too. So anything coming from modern day Europe or the Slavic states comes through Israel. Everything comes through Israel, right? That whole area, just geologically, right? Because it's impossible. It's very difficult to travel the area that's due east of the center of Israel because it's all desert. But south and north, it's not. So it's everything gets funneled to that area. So I feel like it's kind of a little unfair that they're being told they have to purge of all the people and all their culture and all their religion, when naturally it's a natural area for people to be passing through for commerce and everything else. So, but there it is. We come to the death of Joshua. When Joshua dismissed the people, the Israelites all went to their own inheritance to take possession of the land. We kind of heard that in the book of Joshua. The people worshiped the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. So they buried him within the bounds of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. Moreover, the whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them, who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. That's an interesting statement. Read that one again. The whole generation, I'm assuming of all of the Israelites, was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them, who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Wow. So they still have a tabernacle, I assume. they still have a place of worship, but yet the tribes just sort of settled and forgot about all of what got them there, right?
Yeah, they forgot their history.
Yeah. They settled in the land and built cities and forgot about God. Then the Israelites did was it was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshiped the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were all around them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshiped Baal and the Astartes. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them to bring misfortune, as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress. And then the Lord raised up judges, hence the title of the book, who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, but obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. The Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who had persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them, and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their ancestors and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he had died, in order to test Israel whether or not they would take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their ancestors did. The Lord had left those nations, not driving them out at once, and not handed them over to Joshua. So we're getting a setup for, I think of this as they don't really have a system of government, right? They don't have a way of ruling the people. I mean, they sort of had a prophet, essentially. Moses was essentially a prophet in the sense that he spoke to God and he told them, but he wasn't a leader in the sense that they would have later on. You know, he didn't tell them what to do. They kind of lived their life and they followed him, but they followed him because they wanted to know what God was going to say, not because he told them what to do. And Joshua followed that same model, but now they need people to actually tell them what to do and tell them how to live. Even though they have 628 laws, for some reason, they forgot about those laws. So it's setting up what would become the temple rule and the kings with the judges. So it's sort of giving us this idea of what the judges are and would be. Any questions? I'm doing a lot of talking. I'm sorry.
Well, I thought it was kind of interesting because in that last paragraph, it just said the reason that they left all of those people there and the Israelites didn't actually run them out was just to kind of test them to see what would happen. And sure enough, they fell back into their bad ways, you know?
Yeah. Well, we've heard 3 or 4 different reasons. I mean, they're trying, like, they couldn't because they were too powerful, or they couldn't because of whatever, you know. And now because it's a test. Or actually, it was the other way around. It wasn't a test. Earlier in Judges, it said, I've left them there because you've broken the covenant.
Right. To be a thorn in your side.
Yeah. So it's almost, they're just trying to find an excuse why they, you know, they were, God gave them the promised land, but then they're trying to figure out why they don't get the promised land scot-free, right? Why they can't just have it and everybody, why can't the people that have lived there for generations just leave and let us have the land that's promised to us by our God?
Yeah.
Which seems illogical, but yet that's kind of was their thought. And now they can't get rid of the people, so they're is it a test? Is it a punishment? because it's in this first 2 chapters, we've heard both, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both.
And it took them 1 generation to stray away from all of those lessons that they had. And then judges are raised up who I think of them as prophets, but they're sort of, most of the prophets were not leaders, right? They weren't in positions of authority.
Mm.
So we actually on Sunday morning just started reading Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is one of the few that actually was kind of a prophet who was also a leader of the people. But most of the prophets were, people listened to them, but they didn't have any power necessarily over the sway of the people other than their words. Whereas that's why judges it's better to have the term judge, because they're sort of prophets and they're sort of leaders.
Mm.
It sounds like the judges sort of have some control over the armies and that sort of thing, right? But they're also sort of prophets. So it's kind of a little bit of both roles. Okay, so we are on chapter 3. Nations remaining in the land. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test all those in Israel who had no experience of any war in Canaan. It was only that successive generations of Israelites might know war, to teach those who had no experience of it before. The 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians and the Hivites who lived in Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their ancestors by Moses. So the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And they took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshiped their gods. I'm going to be very heretical here and say, what's wrong with that? Just live in peace with each other, but they're breaking the covenant, right, that they made with God. I don't see a problem with settling and being peaceful and intermarrying, but
Well, the problem comes with the worshiping, where there are 2 different forms of worship.
yeah,
It ends up causing all kinds of conflict.
that's true. That's true.
And it still does today.
Yep.
It's true, yeah. And I know still clear through the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says, "Do not be yoked to unbelievers."
Yep. But how many unbelievers came to faith in Christ too? I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between not worshiping other gods and still living peaceably among each other. And they don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, so we're gonna list we're gonna have sort of a little bit of we're coming to one of the best stories in the whole Bible. I'm not even just saying that. The story of, I don't know if I didn't think we would get to it today. We probably won't, but the story of Deborah. Great story.
Yes, it is.
Very violent story, but a great story.
Yes, it is.
I agree.
Yeah, I've been reading a chapter every night, reading ahead. And so, yeah, Deborah was one of the first ones I really enjoyed.
Deborah's, yeah. So Othniel, the Israelite Zebul, was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God, and worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim. And the Israelites served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the Israelites, who delivered them. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, and he went out to war. And the Lord gave King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan Rishathaim. So the land had rest 40 years. And then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So here we're barely in to the dividing of the land among the 12 tribes. Already they've been conquered by, I'm not going to say that, the nation of Aram Naharaim. They've already been conquered. But then 40 years of rest. And then the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. In alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, he went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. So the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. Interesting, a left-handed man.
Yeah.
Being left-handed was considered to be sinful in some places. I don't know in the Bible, but by the Middle Ages, it's sinful to be left-handed.
Sinful.
Yeah. The Israelites sent tribute by him to King Eglon of Moab. Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he fastened it on his right thigh under his clothes. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who would carry the tribute on their way. But he himself turned back at the sculptured stones near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. So the king said, silence, and all the lieutenants went out from his presence. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber and said, I have a message from God for you. So he rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it in Eglon's belly. They also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule and closed the doors of the roof chamber on him and locked them. So I think the roof chamber is the toilet. I'm not sure.
Yeah, because if you go on, it said they think he may be relieving himself.
Yeah. So basically he went in and killed him while he was sitting on the toilet. And left the sword in him. After he had gone, the servants came. When they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought he must be relieving himself in the cool chamber. So they waited until they were embarrassed. When he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened it. There was their Lord lying dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they delayed and passed beyond the sculptured stones and escaped to Sarah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hill country, having him at their head. He said to them, follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies to the Moabites into your hand. So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites, and allowed no one to cross over. At that time, they killed about 10,000 Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. No one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 80 years. So we had rest 40 years. Then we had problems, and then we had rest 80 years. After him came Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. He too delivered Israel. Not much about Shamgar. It says in my notes, Shamgar is a non-Semitic name, a non-Hebrew name. This mysterious figure is not part of the book's chronological system and interrupts the story of Ehud. At the same time, his inclusion rounds out the number of judges to 12. Son of Anath may indicate he was a mercenary, part of the military class dedicated to the war goddess Anath. So it may have been that he was actually a judge that was not part of the Hebrew people, but he still helped the Hebrew people. But they also like the number 12. So they stuck him in there to make sure there were 12.
Okay, that makes
12
sense.
tribes, 12 tribes, 12 judges,
Yeah.
12 disciples. 46. We could read chapter 4. I didn't think we would get to chapter 4. But the problem is, I'll say this ahead of time, I'm not going to be here next week. I'll be at camp. And then I'll be back the next week, and then I'll be gone 2 more weeks. So we're going to have Bible study a lot the next month. But let's read Deborah. We don't do Deborah's song, which is actually kind of pretty. And then we have Gideon. It's a whole other interesting story. All right. So we've had 3 judges. Now we have Deborah. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan. You know, it says after Ehud died. So Shamgar is sort of added in, right?
Hmm.
It's interesting. Anyway, who reigned in Hazor, the commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Ha-Goim. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron and had oppressed Israelites cruelly 20 years. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. Go take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give them into your hand." Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." What woman, we don't know. We do know. I think that's funny that she said that, and it's going to be her. Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kedesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kedesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite had separated from the other Kenites, that is, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had encamped as far away as Elon Beza Ananim, which is near Kadesh. When Sisera was told that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up from Mount Tabor, Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the troops who were with him, from Harosheth Ha-Goim to the Wadi Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. The Lord is indeed going out before you." So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 warriors following him. The Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot, while Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Ha-Goim. All the army of Sisera fell by the sword, no one was left. Now Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between King Jabin of Hazor and the clan of Heber the Kenite. Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, have no fear." So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. Then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened his skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anyone comes and asks you if anyone is here, say no." I want to say, I need to look this up real quick. The covering him with a rug, I think, is covering. I think there's sexual intention with that, but I'm not totally sure. Anyway, I don't want to say that for sure. But Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. Then as Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said to him, "Come, I will show you the man whom you are seeking." So he went into her tent, and there was Sisera lying dead with the tent peg in his temple. So that on that day, God subdued King Jabin of Canaan before the Israelites. Then the hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Jabin of Canaan until they destroyed King Jabin of Canaan. So Jael and Deborah, two women. The women were the heroes of the day. A woman judge, a woman leader of the people, right? It's interesting that we, later on they think, well, they can't be leaders, but they clearly are leaders with female leaders, both in Jewish culture and also in early Christian culture. But for some reason, it always gets interpreted that against that. And Jael. So there's going to be more interesting violence like that. And we're going to read Deborah. We could do it right now for Deborah, but we're gonna wait. Since Deborah Havener's here, we could. The Song of Deborah, and then we're going to go into Gideon, which is some. one of my, I know one of my favorite stories in all of the Bible is when the story of Gideon and selecting the army that was going to go into to fight, and he had too much. He had too many soldiers, right? So God said, you know, pare them down this much, and then pare them down again, and then he says, okay, only the ones that lap water from the stream like dogs can you take. If they cup water in their hands, you can't take them. That story's coming up.
Yeah.
Which is a great story. He's left with 300. He had like 40,000. He was left with 300. Okay, now you can conquer this big army with your 300, and he does.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's faith.
how do you? It's an interesting story. The end story that we read about how Sisera defeated. Sisera's defeated. The army is defeated right away, but the general gets away, right? But you can't let the general get away. So I love that 2 women were instrumental in this whole thing.
Women power, huh?
Woman power. Jael and Deborah. That's pretty cool, I think.
Yeah.
And such a violent, like, she must have known, like, she knew who Sisera was, but she protects him, and then she lulls him to sleep and then drives a tent peg into his head.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly violent image.
Yeah.
And Deborah knew that it would be a woman that would drive, that would help them, as she said earlier. So anyway, we're gonna have other Judges. Has lots of stories like that. Lots of kind of violent stories in Judges, but there's some good ones. So, yeah. So we will not have Bible study next week. But the week after we'll continue with Judges, and we'll probably get the whole story of Gideon, which is a good one.
Okay.
All right. Let's close in prayer. I don't always do that, but I should. Dear Lord, thank you for your word, for the stories of your people, of our people. We see many times about how the people strayed. They strayed from worshiping you. They strayed from following you. Help us to continue to follow you as best we can all the days of our life. So learn from these examples that we need you in our life, that we need your guidance and your comfort. All this in your name we pray. Amen.
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 Dan, how are Dawn and Nancy getting along?
They're home. She didn't end up getting surgery, and I don't know why. So,
Okay.
I do.
oh, you do?
Because they think that she passed the stone when she had that horrible pain before they even went to Lubbock. And they did